Professor Abe Witonsky, assistant professor of philosophy here at Rowan, got his PhD from Temple University in 1996. Worked there on the, as he puts it, the hard problem of consciousness. In particular, two main questions: is consciousness physical? And if it's not, can we understand how it is related to the physical properties of the brain? Right. So this is a really core problem in philosophy of mind. He's been at Rowan since 1994, taught logic of everyday reasoning, introduction to philosophy through film, symbolic logic, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of law. This is
impressive.
He's does all kinds of things, right? He's published a few papers in logic, on Venn diagrams in teaching philosophy, in medicine, on puzzling pain conditions in pain medicine, in philosophy of mind, on physicalism in Philosophia, and the Journal of Philosophical Research. He is presently interested, right, as you will find out today, in the topic of the badness of death, right? So, and according to, this newfound interest in death is a bad thing, Abe is going to present us today a paper entitled A Response to Lucretiuss's Argument Against the Fear of Death. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor Witonsky.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you. And welcome to this talk. I just want to tell you, about a year ago, I was reading this article in the Chronicle for Higher Education by Shelley Kagan. He's a professor at Yale University. And the title of the paper was, Why is Death Bad? And I was reading this, and it never occurred to me. I just never even thought about it. And he was talking about why one's own death, not why someone else's death is bad, but why their own death is bad. And he gives in this very easy to read paper, he gives what he thinks is the answer to this problem, and then he shows a puzzle with it. And he says, I don't know the answer to this puzzle. He gives a bunch of solutions, and he says, none of them are complete stories. And he sort of says, I think it's a puzzle that's still a problem. So I kind of got interested in this puzzle that I'm going to talk to you about today, and I think I have a solution to it. But, we'll see. I'll let you decide. I want to begin by just sort of, I know these aren't the way they normally begin, but I want to ask sort of a question, and then I'll start going through the PowerPoint slides the way they normally are. And this is my question. So I'll just, feel anyone can answer this. Why do you think people fear their own deaths?
You don't know when it's going to come.
You don't know when it's going to come. So the unpredictability, that's the fear. Anything else?
The unknowable.
The unknowable. Okay. The unknowable what?
Well, we're always afraid of what we don't know.
We're afraid we don't know. What don't you know?
Lots of things.
So you fear all those things you don't know. Like we take a class.
Any major change. I should say we fear change. Any major change in our life produces anxiety. Even getting married, having a kid, getting your PhD.
Really?
They all produce anxiety.
All right. Well, I didn't put some of these on the list. I'm glad you're telling me these things. Any other reason? Yeah.
For the people that are left behind and the sadness.
That's one I did put on there. Yeah, you sort of fear for the ones that you're leaving behind, what's going to happen to them. And it's funny, a student pointed that out to me, and I think that's totally right, yeah.
Regret for the things you can't do.
Regret for the things you can't do. Yeah, that's kind of related to what I'll be talking about, very close to it, yeah.
Pain, the process of dying.
Okay, so I'm glad you said that. I'm not really so interested in the process of dying. I think that's something that's reasonable to fear because, people who go through the process of dying, sometimes it's painful and sometimes that's sort of something that's a little scary. I'm talking about this death, the state of that you're going to maybe go into when the process ends. Anything else? Any other reasons? Yeah.
Maybe because we're taught to fear death by popular culture.
That's interesting. I should write these things down, by the way, because I don't have a very good memory. But I like that one, too. And that's not on the list that I'm going to have. Yeah, probably, sort of, we've been conditioned by culture. But why would culture condition us to have this fear? Kevin.
I mean, I kind of come from a religious background. I'm not religious anymore. But I think it might have to do with, if you can get people to fear death, which is something that's out of our control, you can kind of control what else they feel. Like, I guess what I'm saying. It's like it can control what they do kind of thing. Because when I come from like the whole heaven and hell aspect, you know what I'm saying? So from my point of view, a lot of people don't even fear death. It's what happens after death. It's like the fear of the unknown type of thing. But the heaven and hell kind of thing is like them giving them that mindset makes it easier for them to control them. Because it's like you can get this fear aspect of them. And it's like, look, I got these certain things you can do where this won't happen to you. You know, you won't be punished if you do this. And it's like, wow, like maybe I should live my life this way kind of thing. So I think it could just kind of control you.
That's the fear because you lose the control, or that I'm not sure what is it that's.
All right, so the death part. People fear death. You're saying why would someone?
Yeah.
Our culture.
Yeah. Why would you?
I think honestly, it kind of goes on what they believe. You kind of like if they think that, they tell other people and convince them to believe it, and then they just believe it.
Okay, I thought you were going in a different direction, David.
There's a protective gut reaction that doesn't have anything to do with reasons they would come afterward. Just something's after me. I'm going to be over. I'm being attacked.
So it's like this instinctive reaction to things.
Yes. I wouldn't be satisfied with an account that didn't build that into it somewhere or another.
Okay, good. I'm glad I'm not giving an account because I didn't build that into it. Yeah.
Right along with that, young children fear death even before they've been enculturated. 3, 4, 5-year-olds, they start to be afraid of death and are curious about it. I mean, I noticed that in my grandchildren. I don't know where it all came from, but there's a genuine fear of dying. I don't even think they know what it means yet.
So it's not like sort of a reason. There's
no reason. It's just something in I guess something in them, and I don't know where it comes from.
Okay.
Biological need to survive.
Yep.
Okay, but let's say, I want to end here and sort of start the presentation only because I'm going to be running out of time, but let's just talk about the biological need for just 1 second. Would that be you say something that's reasonable? If someone feared because of some biological reaction like you two mentioned, would you say that's a reasonable fear?
I'm not sure reason has anything to do with it.
That's outside the realm of reason. Not everything has to be within the realm of reason. Excuse me, I know you don't agree.
Okay, well keep that in mind because we're going to be talking about sort of are there any reasonable reasons for fearing death? And we're going to look at one in particular, and we're going to look at this one poet, a Roman poet, Lucretius, who sort of argues in a very simple argument that you'll easily follow. He's going to argue that you really shouldn't fear death for this reason. He thinks it's totally unreasonable. But before we get there, I just want to sort of list some of the things that I kind of sort of thought for myself, and maybe agree or disagree. I think people mention they'll fear what they'll experience, the unknown, right? Sort of some people, again, it's not my fear, but some people fear kind of maybe going to hell or not knowing what it's going to be like to be dead. They fear having their life, this great thing, come to an end. Maybe that has to do with the regrets that was mentioned. Mentioned the fear about losing their loved ones, what's going to happen to them, leaving them behind. Here's one that Kagan talks about, and maybe I'll have time to mention, this fear of going into the state of non-existence. So it's not so much the fear of the feeling of damnation if you go to hell and what it's going to be like, but actually that there's nothing it's going to be like. It's this experiential blank, a period of non-consciousness that sort of some people are frightened of that. And so this non-existence. One that I thought about, and I'm not sure if this frightens anybody, but sort of you think your life is just going to be pointless. If you die, what's the point of all this if it doesn't go on forever? It reminds me of a Woody Allen joke, which some of you, I assume many of you are familiar with the comedian Woody Allen, the director. He just had his birthday yesterday, and he says, I don't want to gain immortality through my works. I want to gain immortality through not dying. And so it's kind of if you live forever, maybe your life and your accomplishments will be more meaningful. So some people sort of think, well, if I go out of existence, it's sort of what's the point of it all? And people get, I could, maybe fear is not the right emotion. Maybe it's some sort of other dread or lament. And here's the one that we're going to look at primarily. So I'm focusing on one fear in particular, fear of not getting more of life. All right? And maybe none of you have this, and maybe no one has this, but I kind of have, it's sort of, I wish I could live longer. Maybe I won't wish this, but now if someone sort of said, oh, you know, tomorrow you're going to die, I sort of go, I wish I could have more of this thing called life. And if you told me I wouldn't, I think I would dread that. So I think there is some kind of fear of not getting more life, and I think this is the target of Lucretius. Well, excuse me, this is according to this philosopher who I'm just going to put up. Jeremy Simon says Lucretius is trying to show us that that fear is not rational. So that is what I'm focusing on. There's lots of reasons for fear, but I'm only going to focus on number 6. And this is, let you just read this, and I'll probably just repeat it. So Jeremy Simons is bioethicist at Columbia University, and he wrote this paper that I read, and that's what I'm responding to in today's talk. He gives an argument that responds to Lucretius, and I'm giving an argument against Simon's argument. All right, so Simon says this poet, Lucretius, argues that it's unreasonable to have this fear. And so today, what I'm going to do, 4 goals. I probably won't accomplish them, but I'll try my best to give you just a quick historical background, which I know very little about the history, but I know enough to give a quick one, right? Some historical background to this Lucretius argument. To explain Jeremy Simon's interpretation of and reply to Lucretius's argument. To explain my reply to Simon's reply to Lucretius. As you see, it's getting more complicated. I'm not looking forward to this part. I mean, this is my paper, really, but it's going to get kind of complicated. I hope I can pull this off. I try to make this as simple as possible, and it's, you know, but with doing PowerPoint, I realize it's difficult to do, so bear with me. And finally, at the end of it, is to offer a new response to Lucretius' argument, which I think is the correct answer for why Lucretius is wrong and why you should fear your death a little bit. All right, I don't mean to be too depressing. So here's a little historical context. So like right after Plato, there's this guy, this Greek philosopher Epicurus, and Epicurus, from what little I understand of Epicurus, is sort of like your goal in life is to get this state of ataraxia, or however you pronounce ataraxia, and this ultimate happiness or tranquility. And one way for Epicurus to get tranquility is you want to get freedom from things that cause fear, like the gods, fear of death. And so he gives this argument that I think is actually correct. He sort of says death is nothing to us. While we exist, there is no death. And when death happens, we don't exist. For someone like Epicurus, there is no like problem. The first problem, let me just go back a second. So right here, a lot of people sort of say, oh, I don't know what's going to happen when I die, right? You know, I'm worried that I'm going to like burn in hell. Well, for Epicurus, there is nothing. There's no consciousness. There's nothing to fear. So he argues that way, and I'm not going to look at Epicurus' view, but Lucretius gives a poem right here. This guy, Lucretius, gives this like long epic poem, sort of trying to present Epicurus' views to the Roman readers, and he sort of gives, early on in this poem, De Rerum Natura, which means on the nature of things, he gives a bunch of Epicurus' arguments, one of them that I just mentioned, and here's this argument that I'm going to be looking at, and he says, look back at time, before our birth. In this way, nature holds before our eyes the mirror of our future after death. Is this so grim, so gloomy? Okay, so what do you think he's arguing? Does anyone have any clue by this little passage, these few lines? Yeah.
Well, because we talked about it in class, but if we don't remember like what it was like before we were born, if it's just like this black space and we shouldn't fear our death, it's the same way.
Right, but it's not that we don't even remember. He's not like Plato that we had this existence before this life. He said there was nothing to fear before we were born, right? This state of non-existence before we were born, so why should we fear this period of non-existence, this thing called death after we died? There's nothing to fear. They're mirror images of each other. Period of non-existence after we die, period of non-existence before we were born, and he thinks And what he's trying to do is he's trying to comfort, from what I understand, Lucretius was really frightened of death, so he was kind of comforting himself. And he was also trying to comfort his Roman readers who he's introducing Epicurus's ideas to. And he's not a philosopher, so he's not trying to give like this philosophical argument. It's sort of, he's giving an argument, but it's sort of, again, he's presenting something to try to give therapy or relief to his readers. All right? Well, okay, so here we have a philosophical puzzle, and this is what I found very interesting when I was reading the Kagan article in the Chronicle for Higher Education. Why is it reasonable to fear the future, fear the time after we die, but not the time before we were born? This is Lucretius's puzzle. And here we have two guys, right? Two philosophers. One on I guess your left, Thomas Nagel, right? And he writes in, I think it was, he writes a paper called Death in 1979, where he tries to give a solution to Lucretius's puzzle up there. I'm not going to talk about Nagel's solution. I don't think it's right. Many people today don't think it's right. I don't even think Nagel thinks it's right anymore, right? But he says in 1986 in a book called The View from Nowhere, he thinks this puzzle up here is the most perplexing puzzle. What does he say? The most perplexing feature of our attitude toward death. So he thinks this is a real serious puzzle. And here's this guy Kagan, who I introduced, the Chronicle for Higher Education, a Yale professor who when I teach Introduction to Philosophy, I have my students like read and will listen to his lecture, and he doesn't think that there's an answer to this puzzle, or at least no one's given a good answer, an adequate answer yet. I call them the puzzle pushers, right? You know, and I was taken in by these puzzle pushers. I thought there was some serious puzzle, right? So what is Lucretius trying to argue? We kind of got this sketchy idea that he's trying to sort of say, well, there's some kind of mirror analogy between death and prenatal non-existence and non-existence after you die. You shouldn't fear one, you shouldn't fear the other. But there have been different interpretations of what Lucretius is after. And this guy, this bioethicist, Jeremy Simon, gives the following interpretation. I am not going to argue about what the correct interpretation is. So don't anyone try to pin me down on what the correct. I am going to assume that this Jeremy Simon is correct on his interpretation. And I'm going to say, given his interpretation, his answer is no good. All right. So I kind of like constructed, made it more formalized into a very simple argument. He says, look, we don't wish to be born earlier, no one does, in order to get more life. He thinks such a wish is unreasonable to be born earlier, to get more life. Some of you may want to be born earlier, maybe to experience things, I don't know, maybe during the Roman Empire. You might have wanted to be born earlier, but that's for some different kinds of experiences. No one wants to be born earlier to get more life. But if you were born earlier, you might be able to get more life, right? If you had an earlier birth, you might think, wow, I could have had more years of life. Again, here we have the mirror. The time after our death is in all relevant respects to this, the same to us as the time before our birth. That was that little quote I gave from, part of the De Rerum Natura conclusion. So it would be unreasonable to wish to die later in order to get more life. This is the argument. Jeremy Simon doesn't think this is a good argument, but this is his interpretation of Lucretius's argument. So let me just let everyone pay attention to this, just soak it in for 2 seconds before we kind of explain Simon's rejection of it. All right, so again, it's pretty simple, straightforward. We don't have a certain attitude about the past. The past is similar to the future, therefore we shouldn't have a certain attitude towards the future. All right, so that's what Lucretius is trying to argue. Simon says in this paper that he's written that if you're going to give a good reply to this argument, you have to have passed two conditions. One, the reply has to be easy to understand. And he argues in the following way. He says, look, Lucretius is not a philosopher. He's trying to give this argument to, again, give relief to his Roman readers. So what you need, if you're going to give an adequate reply to Lucretius, it better be an intuitive, common sense, everyday kind of reasoning response. It can't be like using these deep metaphysical concepts that philosophers use, because that would not appeal to the kind of reader that Lucretius was trying to convince. So that's what you have to give according to Simon in order to be given adequate reply, and I'll concede that. So I think that if you're going to like give a good reply to this Lucretiuss argument, it better be easy to understand. And the other point that Simon makes is that it's got to be a quantitative response, because he's talking about quantity of life, right? He's not talking about different kind of experience going back and having an experience of the Roman Empire. He's talking about more lifespan. See you later, Bruce.
Sorry.
No problem. So if you're going to give a response, it better be, according to Simon, a quantitative response. And what I'm going to try to do is even stick to that condition as well. Give something that's easy to understand and quantitative as well. All right. Here's Simon's reply. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. I just think it's wrong. And it goes like this. The reason we wish to die later is that a later death would guarantee us more life. Right? If you suppose I'm going to die in, I don't know, 2044 from a bus accident, right? Well, if I could live till like 2055, that would give me more life. So if I could die later, that would guarantee us more life. He's going to try to show us that there's a relevant difference if we were born earlier. So he says, whereas the reason why we don't wish to be born earlier is that an earlier birth would not guarantee us more life. Why not? This is because no one knows how an earlier birth would affect the course of one's life and consequently the time of one's death. So if you were born earlier, according to Simon, you have no guarantee that you would have a longer life. But if you were to die later, you would have guaranteed that you'd have a longer life. Hey, Lucretius, you're wrong. They're not mirror images. There's a relevant distinction between the time after you die and the time before you were born. Okay? So that's Simon's reply. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems like when I first read it, I said, that sounds like it's right. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I said, well, maybe not so fast. So Simon considers an objection. I actually may finish this in time. Simon actually considers an objection to his view. He only considers one objection. So what I'm going to do is talk about his objection and give you what Simon's reply to this happiness objection. And I'm going to tell you why I think his reply is no good. So this is again what Simon considers in his paper, and he sort of says the reason that people don't, this is the objection to this argument that we just gave. The reason that people don't wish to be born earlier is not that they have doubts about getting a longer life, but rather it's because they have reason to doubt that their lives would be as happy as they are now. Let you soak that in. Right? Again, so he's assuming this. Simon's argument assumes that the reason people don't wish to be born earlier is that he thinks that if you were born earlier, you wouldn't be guaranteed a longer life, and people would have doubts about that. That's why they don't want to be born earlier, but they would be guaranteed a longer life if they could die later. The objection is saying, no, Simon, you've got that wrong. The reason people have don't want to be born earlier is not because of longevity of life. It's rather because they know, they have good reason to believe they wouldn't have as happy a life as they do right now. Okay? That's the objection to Simon. That's the only one he considers in the paper. Okay, here's how Simon responds to this objection. He first says, he gives two responses. He says, since one's nature and nurture, your genetics are going to be the same if you were born earlier, and your nurture would be the same. You'd have the same parents, probably born in the same area of the world. If one were born earlier, it's unlikely one would be less happy. So he's trying to argue that you have no reason to doubt that you'd be less happy if you were born earlier. He says, why should you? You're going to have the same parents, the same genetics. You have good reason to believe you'd just be equally happy. So he thinks that's his first move in countering the happiness objection. And the other move, he says, since people think This one's a little complicated. Since people think that other people, so I think that you are more or less just as happy as they are now, they wouldn't be concerned about losing happiness if they were born earlier. So his view is, he has this view, he says, people don't, when they look at other people, they think that other people are just as happy as they are now, so they're not going to be worried about losing happiness if they were born earlier. Okay? So those are the two moves he makes, and what I'm going to do right now is I think both of these moves are no good. So I'm going to respond to both of these. Are you following this? Is this making sense? I hope it's making some sense. Anyway, my reply to Simon's reply to the happiness objection. Okay, so here's, again, this is his argument. Since one's nature and nurture will be the same if one were born earlier, it's unlikely that one would be less happy if one were born earlier. Okay, that was what we just said. Here's my reply. I'll let you read this because I'll just give you a break from hearing my voice. So my reply is, you can't give this argument, Simon, because you just told us we would have no idea how long our life would be if we were born earlier, right? But I don't know how he can say, if he goes, I have good reason to believe that given that you'd have the same nature and nurture, you would be just as happy. Why can't I come back and say, well, if you have the same nature and nurture, then you have good reason to believe that your life would be, have a certain lifespan. So I think he's not entitled to this move because I think it contradicts his main argument. The other move that I said he makes is since people think that others are more or less just as happy as they aren't concerned about losing happiness if they were born earlier. Here my reply is this. So what he says, like when he wrote this, and I read this, his premise, I said, what do really people think about other people's happiness? When I think about, let's say, my driving skills, and I look at other people, I think my driving skills are probably better than the average person. But when I think about happiness, and when I look at other people, like I look at Facebook pages, and I'm sort of thinking, are these people having a happier life than me? I tend to think they are. I think he's wrong. Right? So I kind of did, and I was sort of thinking, well, maybe that's just me, when I look at Facebook, what do other people, think when they look at Facebook or when they think about other people? So I did a little research in psychology, and there's actually some recent studies done on this, and according to these psychologists, that people actually, there are studies that indicate or show that, people do underestimate the prevalence of negative emotions in other people. So it does suggest that we underestimate how unhappy people are. We just see their smiles on the Facebook pages and all their accomplishments, and we go, oh, these people are really doing much better than me. So I think his intuition is just wrong. It's not my intuition, and I think there's some psychological studies that indicate that he's wrong. So that's my reply to his happiness objection, and that's the only objection that Simon considers, but I thought of a few other objections to his view. All right, second objection to Simon's reply. Yes?
Can I also ask, to go back to the previous slide,
shoot.
Why would thinking that other people are just as happy make you unconcerned about losing happiness?
Because if you're sort of thinking about being born earlier, imagining being born earlier, and you're kind of you're worried, like if I were born earlier, I'm going to lose this kind of happy life that I have now. But all of a sudden I show you, like he says, no, you don't really have that worry, because if you're born earlier, you would have a life that would be just as happy, and that's the way people normally think. And I just think that's not the way people normally think.
It seems like if today people are just as happy, they could also be just as happy earlier, but all less happy. So I could still be worried about losing happiness on the absolute level, even if I'm relatively as happy as others, right? So I'm not sure if that argument even necessarily.
His or mine?
His argument.
Okay, good. All right.
Without your research objection.
Okay.
If we're all just as happy now, but we're relatively happy, but
Right.
earlier we were all just as happy but not happy,
Right.
I can still be worried about losing happiness, right? So I'm not worried about losing relative happiness. I'm
Gotcha.
worried about losing happiness.
That's a good point. That's a nice point. Okay. Yeah.
It's just a question in regards to why did you accept his premise? People think that others, or rather, why did you challenge this, like his premise, like people think that others are more or less happy as they are?
Right.
In response to like that, and you gave research evidence and not questioned and accepted the one before this in regards to nature and nurture being the same, and accepting that in regards to nature and nurture not being relative to the conditions of the environment, like given a speculative like amount of time that person may have. So I'm just questioning, why did you accept one premise before but then challenge the other, this one particular one?
I didn't say his argument is wrong. I just said that given how his main argument against Lucretius, it's contradicting his main argument against Lucretius. So he can't have it both ways. That's all my point is. He may be fine here, but then he has to give up his reply to Lucretius. But if he holds his reply to Lucretius, then he can't use that argument against his reply to the happiness.
More or less like he kind of contradicted his own rule.
Correct. That's what I'm trying to point out. Yeah.
So I have the question, even going back further, nature and nurture, that doesn't guarantee anything, since who you meet, where you are, the people that you contact. To use nature and nurture as
Right.
the pure basis for how you're going to be.
He wants to just argue that your life is pretty much going to be the same. It's not like you're going to be like born into some totally foreign thing. You don't really have to worry so much about, again, what you're actually saying is similar to my ultimate reply. So I'm kind of want to hold off on that, and you'll see what I mean. But I think he's just sort of saying, people don't worry about happiness. Don't worry, that's not a good objection. People, it's irrelevant to my thing for this nature-nurture thing, and also given his intuitions about how others view other people. Okay, so, all right, so here's a second objection to Simon's reply, and we're still doing okay with time. All right, here's one that he doesn't consider. This is one that I thought of. So Simon's reply assumes makes the following assumption. No one knows how an earlier birth would affect the course of one's life and consequently the time of one's death. This is what Simon says, and I am going to try to argue against that assumption, that no one, like if you were born earlier, you would not have any reason to believe anything about your lifespan. And I think that's just an unreasonable assumption, and I'm going to appeal to two contemporary philosophers, both alive, Fred Feldman, and who wrote some book I read, I can't remember the title, something about the Grim Reaper, and Shelley Kagan again. So Feldman says, and it's interesting, he's actually gave a slightly different reply to the Lucretius puzzle. And he sort of says, what you're doing when you're imagining dying later is, sort of, if I die later, you're kind of extending your life. Let me see if I can explain, if I remember Feldman correctly. If I kind of go, well, let's say I'm going to get hit by a bus in 2044, but I kind of imagine, I don't die in 2044, I die 10 years later, then I'm guaranteed more life, more years of life. I haven't done the math, so I don't know how many more years, how long my life would be, but I can kind of, when I project in the future, I sort of see a longer life. But when I think about being born earlier, what according to Feldman is you shift your whole lifespan to an earlier time. It's not like you're getting more years of life, you're just shifting the whole lifespan to an earlier time. So according to Feldman, you actually have reason to believe, if you think about that, when you imagine yourself being born earlier, does that give you, do you imagine living, like let's say you were born in 1800, does that mean you believe that you're going to live until 2015? Or does it mean that, let's say your life right now is going to live, let's say 70 years. If you're born in 1800, then you'll live till 1870. You follow that? So that's his response, that's his answer to Lucretius. That's why, according to Feldman, there's a relevant difference between the future and the past. In the future, you can imagine living longer, but if you kind of imagine going back in time, you don't get longer. So that's Feldman's answer to the Lucretius problem. But I'm using Feldman to reply to this assumption. I think if Feldman's right, and I think there's something right about what he says, then that's wrong. But I don't think Feldman's entirely right. I think he's part of the story is right, and enough of the story is right to show that this is wrong. But I think Kagan gives a problem with Feldman's view, and Kagan's objection to Feldman also shows a problem with this. And Kagan gives this example of an asteroid. He says, imagine someone who is 20 years old, and this woman is 20 years old, and she's finding out that in a week an asteroid's going to hit the planet Earth and destroy everyone, including herself, right? Kagan says it would be totally reasonable for her to wish she were born earlier, right? Because if she were born earlier, she'd have more years of life, right? So Kagan wants to say that we can imagine situations. Here's a thought experiment that if you were born earlier, you would have a longer life. And so, Feldman, you're wrong. It's not every time when you imagine you're going to be born earlier, you shift the lifespan. We can imagine cases where that's not the case. So if Kagan's right, then we do have another reason to deny this assumption, right? Again, the assumptions no one knows, but if we have the asteroid case, we do know. If you were born earlier, you would have more time. So those are the two reasons where I argue against. That's my second objection to Simon's reply. Final objection, and we're almost done, and this has to do with my view of the answer to Lucretius, and I call it the content objection. Let you read this. So it's like what Marianne said. It's not the happiness, it's the content. And you might ask me, what do I mean by content, right? When I refer to content of one's life, I mean one's experiences, relationships. And here's the little twist, by the way. Other philosophers, Elizabeth Harman and Walter Kaufman, are two people who've given the content objection or the content reply to Lucretius. And I've added this sort of twist, which I'll talk about in a second. So I think that's what people don't want to give up. Because if you think of yourself in the future, those things get retained, right? You're not going to lose your relationships. You're not going to lose your experiences. You're not going to lose how you think about yourself now, right? But if you were born at an earlier time, it's very, very unlikely you'll have any of that. It's maybe logically possible, but it's very unlikely. And that's what I think he doesn't consider. And I think that's the explanation for why people don't want to be born earlier, right? Because they're not going to get the content, the unique content of their lives if they were born earlier, but they would get that if they were to die later. All right? So I have to give credit to my wife. She's helped me tremendously on this paper. So, in fact, she's going to get a co-authorship on this paper. She's done so much editing on it. So that's why I have our reply to it. So my objection to Jeremy Simon's argument is exactly the same as my reply to Lucretius's argument. The reason we want to die later is that a later death would guarantee us more life with a content that matters to us. Again, relationships, experiences, and our current personality. I mean, Kagan made this point that I heard, and I thought this was kind of profound. If you think of yourself in the future, and you can think of yourself, let's say 1,000 years from now, right? And that's you. But that person 1,000 years from now doesn't remember anything that you value right now. Doesn't remember what your name, what you call yourself, what your family is, doesn't remember your friends. Would that person, even if it's you, matter to you when you think about that future self? And Kagan wants to argue no. What matters, what Kagan pointed out that matters, and I kind of agree with him, is that when you think about your future self, what's so important, what so much matters is that that future self has a personality that's like similar to the personality that you have now. And if that future self doesn't have a personality that's similar to the personality you have now, then who cares? That's Kagans' point, and I think it's right, and that's what we get in a future person, but we wouldn't get, very unlikely we'd get it if we were born in the past. The reason we don't want to be born earlier is that an earlier birth would not guarantee us more life with the content that matters to us. We wouldn't have the unique relationships, good or bad, happy or not happy. We wouldn't have them, and that's what we want. I thought of one reply that Simon might give to my content reply, and I'm kind of eager in a few minutes, I'm almost done, to hear if you have any replies to my content reply. But this is one thing I thought that Simon might say that I consider in my paper. Remember I said that Lucretiuss's argument is quantitative. More life, more life. It's sort of like a meal. That's this great meal. You want it to continue for longer, more food, more food. And Lucretius is the same idea. It's sort of like a lot of people want more of this life. Give me more, gluttons for life, right? And so he says a good and adequate reply has to be totally quantitative. My reply is not purely quantitative, right? I'm talking about content, right? And he's talking about quantity. Maybe my reply is irrelevant. All right, and this is my reply to that, right? I think this reply misses the point of why a person would wish for more life, right? She just doesn't want more life of any kind, right? You could get more life of being in a coma. Who wants that, right? You want more life of the kind that you have now. And an earlier birth would not get it. A later death most likely would. Probably not guaranteed, but it most likely would. Okay, so summing up, I think Simon's reply to Lucretius is no good. I've explained why, and basically it's this content objection. I think it focuses solely on the quantity of lifespan, as such doesn't correctly explain our asymmetry of attitudes. So what's this asymmetry of attitudes? The asymmetry of attitudes, which I wanted to say a little bit, but I forgot. So we have symmetrical means sort of like the same. So we have this attitude where we kind of fear the future, we don't fear the past, right? Prenatal non-existence, we don't fear. Post-mortem non-existence, we fear. At least some of us do, right? There's an asymmetry. Right? Lucretius wants to make it symmetrical. He wants to say our attitude should be the same. But there's two ways you can go with symmetry. You can sort of say, well, maybe we should fear both of them the same. That's another way you can go with symmetry. No, Lucretius says no. The way we should go is be symmetrical and not fearing anything. So he thinks we should just be symmetrical and not fearing anything. I think there's a recent philosopher who thinks that there are some philosophers who think that we should fear both. Have argued that we should fear both the time before we were born and wish we were born earlier, and the time after we die. That's not my view. That's not Lucretius's view. I think I take the natural common sense view, and the common sense view is the future is frightening. The past, who cares about it, right? So I am an asymmetry. I believe there's an asymmetry of attitudes. Again, Simon agrees with that, but I think his response is not adequate. Again, I'm mentioning the content of our lives. We have to take that into account. Once we can do this, we can understand why people wish to die later but not be born earlier. We can see why such an asymmetrical wish is reasonable. I hope I showed you why it's reasonable, because I think content is important to us. And finally, Lucretius' puzzle solved, right? It's not such a big mystery. That's it.